My grandson hadn't spoken a single word in 3 years, not to doctors, not to therapists, not even to me, and I'd learned to listen to his silence like it was a language of its own. That night, as soon as his parents drove away, the house felt too quiet, and he suddenly looked up at me with a steadiness that didn't belong to a child. He took my hand, leaned close, and whispered something no one else was supposed to hear, something that made my heart stop and my legs go weak, because in that moment, I realized his silence had been protecting me all along. If a child who never spoke chose one sentence to break his silence, would you be ready to hear it? Tell me where you're watching from. My grandson stopped speaking when he was 5 years old, and at first, everyone thought it was just a phase, something he would outgrow with time and patience, but months turned into years and his silence settled into our lives like heavy furniture no one knew how to move. Doctors used careful words, therapists avoided promises, and his parents learned to speak around him instead of to him, lowering their voices as if sound itself might hurt him. I was the only one who stayed still long enough to notice how alert he actually was, how his eyes followed every movement in a room, how his small hands tightened when arguments began and relaxed only when the house grew quiet again. When his parents left him with me for a few days that winter, they framed it as a break they desperately needed, but I felt the strain underneath their smiles, the kind that builds when people carry secrets they no longer know how to hide. The first evening passed without incident, just the two of us sharing soup at the kitchen table while snow pressed softly against the windows, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his bowl, and I told him stories he'd heard before, not because I expected an answer, but because I wanted him to know I was still here. Later that night, after I tucked him into bed, I noticed the front door lock was loose again, something I'd meant to fix but kept putting off, and an unease crept in that I couldn't quite explain. I told myself I was just tired, that living alone too long can make your thoughts wander into dark corners, but as I lay awake, I replayed small moments from the past few years, raised voices in the other room, the way my grandson used to flinch when his father's temper snapped, how his mother's laugh had grown brittle and thin. Sometime after midnight, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, and when I opened my door, he was standing there, pale and serious, not frightened, just focused, like someone carrying a responsibility too large for their body. I reached for him, ready to guide him back to bed, when he suddenly took my hand and held it with surprising strength, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my chest tighten. He had never initiated touch like that before, and in the quiet of the house, I could hear my own heart beating as if it were trying to warn me. That was when he leaned closer, his lips trembling not with fear, but with effort, and I understood that whatever had kept him silent all these years was pressing hard against him now, demanding to be released. I didn't know yet what he was going to say, only that the stillness we had lived in for so long was about to break, and that once it did, there would be no way to put the pieces back where they were before. He whispered my name first, barely louder than a breath, and I froze because even that small sound felt impossible, like watching something long broken suddenly move on its own. Then he told me there was a man who came to the house late at night when the lights were off, a man who told him not to make noise and to pretend he was asleep, and as the words came out haltingly, as if each one had to be forced past years of fear, my hands began to shake. He said the man had been there again earlier that week, that his parents argued afterward in the kitchen, voices sharp and panicked, and that he heard his father say they couldn't let anyone find out, not even me. As he spoke, pieces I had tried to ignore slid into place, the loose lock on the door, the sense of being watched, the way my grandson always positioned himself between me and the hallway whenever his parents visited. I pulled him into my arms and felt how thin he was, how tense, like a child who had been standing guard for far too long, and I realized his silence hadn't been confusion or illness, it had been strategy. He had learned that staying quiet kept people from noticing him, from asking questions, from putting him in danger, and somehow, in that small, frightened logic, he had decided it also kept me safe. I didn't ask him for details, not then, because the weight of what he'd already shared was enough to make my vision blur, and I focused instead on getting us through the night. I locked every door, pulled a chair against the handle, and slept with my phone in my hand, waking at every creak of the house until morning finally came. The next day, I called the authorities, not with anger, but with a calm I didn't recognize in myself, the kind that comes when fear turns into clarity, and they listened because the story finally made sense out loud. When my son and his wife returned, they were met with questions they couldn't deflect, and I watched their confidence crumble as the truth surfaced piece by piece, not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable. My grandson stayed close to me the entire time, silent again, but different now, his quiet no longer heavy, but resting, as if it had finally done its job. In the weeks that followed, professionals use careful language and gentle steps, and I learned that healing doesn't arrive all at once, it inches forward when safety becomes routine and trust is allowed to grow back slowly. One evening, long after the house had settled into a new rhythm, my grandson sat beside me on the couch, leaned his head against my arm, and said a single word, "Grandma," clear and unafraid. I didn't cry or gasp or tell anyone else right away, because some moments are meant to be held quietly, like proof that silence can end when it no longer has to protect anyone.